Alright. Just woke up. It's 3 p.m. Um, Thinking about making a coffee. I'm thinking about going out to buy some cheese and some bread and some energy drinks. That's what I'm thinking about. My mouth still hurts. That's what's hurting. That's been there for a few days now. Anyway, I better get myself going. You know what? I can eat some of these peanuts. I've only eaten a whole packet of these. Big D. Honey roast peanuts. Make some coffee as well. It's so much more convenient to just order deliveries over to the house for food. But it saves a bit of money if I make the effort to go to the shop myself. It also gives me something to do. It gets me out of the house for a bit. And it gives me some vlog content. What I need now more than ever is content for the vlog. I always have something to say. I can always talk about what I'm thinking, but I would like there to be more dynamic sort of activities going on in the video. So it makes sense for me to go out shopping. I'm pretty sure that I only just want to get what I mentioned then. Cheese, bread, and energy drinks. And then I guess maybe some condiments, like mayonnaise and maybe some chili sauce, something like that. I'm not going to be doing that straight away. I want to just hang out for a bit and let my senses come to after being asleep for such a long time. Pretty sure I was up until 4 a.m. I got up again briefly at about 9ish. I think I actually videoed that. That was when I ate a tin of beans. But then I went back to sleep again. Until now. Anyway, I found a bunch of books yesterday. And I wanted to read them. They're only really short, so I'll read one now. This one is Disney Winnie the Pooh, The Sweetest Christmas. On snowy Christmas Eve, Winnie the Pooh looked up and down, in and out, and all around his house. He had a tree set up in his living room. It was decorated with some candles in honey pots. Pooh looked at the tree and tapped his head. "Something seems to be missing," he said. He walked over to the window and peered outside. Then he walked back to the tree and thought some more. Suddenly, a knocking sound startled Pooh. Rap-a-tap-tap. He turned towards his front door. "Maybe whatever it is I can't remember I'm missing is outside my door," Pooh said. When Pooh opened the door, he found a small snowman on his front step. "Hello, Pooh Bear," the snowman said as he shivered. Pooh thought the voice sounded very familiar. He invited the snowman inside. After standing beside the fire for a few minutes, the snowman began to melt. The more he melted, the more he looked like Piglet. "Oh my," said Pooh. He was happy to see his friend instead of a snowman. "Oh my," said Piglet. Now that the snow had melted off him, he could see Pooh's glowing Christmas tree. "Are you going to hang popcorn on your tree?" Piglet asked. "There was popcorn," Pooh admitted, "but I ate it. Now I only have string." Pooh thought for a second, wondering if he was supposed to get more popcorn, but that wasn't it either. "Then we can use the string to wrap the presents you're giving," Piglet said. Something began to tickle at Pooh's brain. It was the something missing that he hadn't been able to remember. "I forgot to get presents," Pooh exclaimed. "Don't worry, Pooh," Piglet said. "I'm sure you'll think of something." Soon it was time for Piglet to go home and wrap his own presents. He said goodbye to his friend and went back out into the cold and snowy night. Pooh stood beside his tree and tapped his head while he thought. Where could he find presents for his friends? It was already Christmas Eve. Was it too late? He thought some more. He sat down in his cosy chair. Then he got up and had a small smackerel of honey. He peered out of the window and watched the snow fall. Then he had an idea. He still didn't know what to do about the presents he'd forgotten, but he knew where to find help. "Hello," Pooh called, as he knocked on Christopher Robin's door. Christopher Robin opened the door and smiled when he saw the visitor. "Come in, Pooh Bear," he said. "Merry Christmas." "Why do you look so sad on the most wonderful night of the year?" Pooh was just about to explain about the forgotten presents, and something caught his eye. He pointed at the stockings over the fireplace. "What are those for?" he asked. "Those are stockings to hold Christmas presents," explained Christopher Robin. "But Christopher Robin," Pooh said, "what if someone forgot to find presents for his friends? And what if that same someone doesn't have stockings to hang because he doesn't wear any?" Pooh looked down at his bare feet, then back up at Christopher Robin. "Silly old bear," Christopher Robin said. He took Pooh up to his room. They dug through his drawers until Pooh found 7 stockings. "Thank you, Christopher Robin," Pooh said. He smiled. He'd picked a stocking for each of his friends and one for himself to hang over his fireplace. He hurried off to deliver the stockings to his friends. As he walked through the 100-acre wood, he thought about the presents he still needed for the stockings. "I will get the presents later," Pooh said to himself. "The stockings come first." Pooh stopped at each of his friends' houses. Everyone was asleep. He quietly hung the stockings where his friends would find them. Each one had a tag that read, "From Pooh." When Pooh got back to his house, he climbed into his cosy chair in front of the roaring fire. "Now I must think about presents for my friends," he said. Pooh was tired from finding the stockings and delivering them to his friends' houses. Before he knew it, his thinking turned into dreaming. He was fast asleep. The next morning, Pooh woke to a loud thumping noise. "Thump-a-bump-bump. I wonder who that could be," he said. He climbed out of his chair and opened the door. "Merry Christmas, Pooh," his friends cried. There on Pooh's doorstep stood Tigger, Rabbit, Piglet, Owl, Eeyore, and Gopher. They were each carrying their stocking from Pooh. Then he remembered what had happened the night before. He had fallen asleep before giving presents to his friends. "Oh, bother," he said. Then he realized that his friends were all talking at once. They were thanking him for their gifts. "No more cold ears in the winter with my new cap," Piglet said. "My stripy sleeping bag is Tiggerific," exclaimed Tigger. "So is my new carrot cover," Rabbit said. "This rock collecting bag will sure make work go faster," Gopher said. Eeyore swished his tail to show Pooh his new tail warmer. "No one's ever given me such a useful gift before," he said. Owl told Pooh that his new windsock would help him with the day's weather report. Pooh looked at his friends. They were very happy with their stockings, even though there weren't any presents in them. "Something very nice is going on," Pooh said. "It is very nice, Pooh Bear," Piglet said. "It's called Christmas, Buddy Bear," Tigger said. He patted Pooh on the back. Then Pooh watched in surprise as each of his friends placed a honey pot in his own stocking. "I don't know what to say," Pooh told his friends. He was thrilled by their gifts. Honey was his favourite treat. "Christmas is a wonderful time of year," Rabbit said, "especially when you have good friends to share it with." "Yeah," Tigger agreed, "but I know how we can make the day even sweeter." He looked at the honey pot in Pooh's hands. An idea tickled at the back of Pooh's brain. "Let's all have lunch together," Pooh said. He passed out the honey pots his friends had just bought. Christmas, what a sweet day indeed. Alright, I've got some more. I'm going to keep reading these. This one is Pinocchio, Perfect Gift. Christmas was just a few days away. Geppetto, the old woodcarver, was busy in his workshop making toy soldiers and pretty dolls for the boys and girls in the village. There seemed to be more toys than usual to make this year, and Geppetto was afraid that he wouldn't get all the work done in time. Geppetto's son, Pinocchio, wanted to help his father. He knew that Geppetto worked harder during the Christmas season than at any other time of the year. While Geppetto worked day and night to make all the toys, Pinocchio, with the help of Jiminy Cricket, decorated the house. They put up a tree and strung popcorn on its branches. They even hung prickly garlands of holly. This would be Pinocchio's first Christmas as a real boy, so he wanted it to be special. Jiminy, Pinocchio said, I want to find the perfect gift for Geppetto. He should have something special. Will you help me? Jiminy said. Well, if you ask me, maybe he would like a new knife to carve with, Pinocchio interrupted, though he worried he might not have enough money for that. What about some warm gloves? He could use them when he goes out on cold nights to deliver his toys. You know, Pinocchio, I wonder if a better gift would be, Jiminy began. Socks, Pinocchio cried, or a new hat. Come on, Jiminy, let's go to the shops and see what we can find. Pinocchio hurried out the door. Jiminy had to run to keep up. In the shops, Pinocchio looked at socks, hats, gloves, scarves, and even a warm woolen coat. Everything was too small, too expensive, or too ordinary. Pinocchio wanted to find something special. By Christmas Eve, Pinocchio still hadn't found the perfect gift for Geppetto. He couldn't help feeling sad. What am I going to do? Pinocchio asked Jiminy. Well, I do have this idea, he replied. Really? Pinocchio asked. Please tell me. Jiminy sat him at the table and handed him a quill pen. You want to give your father something he really needs? I sure do, Pinocchio beamed. Write this, Jiminy said. Dear Geppetto, my gift to you is an extra pair of hands and an extra willing heart. Love, Pinocchio. When Pinocchio finished writing, he looked up at Jiminy. Now what? Now you put the note in here. Jiminy held out a box. Pinocchio dropped the note in. Then Jiminy wrapped the package with bright paper and a big bow. Geppetto will be very happy with this gift, Jiminy said. But it's just a scrap of paper, Pinocchio said. What sort of a gift is that? Jiminy smiled. You might be surprised. After a Christmas Eve dinner together, Pinocchio presented Geppetto with his gift. I hope you like it, said Pinocchio. Geppetto untied the bow and tore the wrapping paper away. Why, this is the perfect present, he cried. I could use an extra pair of hands in my workshop. How did you know, Pinocchio? Pinocchio smiled. Jiminy had been right. He was surprised at how much joy his simple gift brought to his father. I'm glad to help, Pinocchio said. I can start right now if you want. Pinocchio went to Geppetto's workshop. He swept up the wood shavings and boxed and wrapped the new toys. He made labels for each box so that Geppetto would know which child each gift was for. The two of them made the perfect team. When Geppetto set out to deliver the last of the gifts, Pinocchio went up to bed. He was tired after helping his father all night. As he drifted off to sleep, he promised himself that he would help out more often. That night, the Blue Fairy appeared. Because you have been so thoughtful this year, I have come to grant you one very special Christmas wish, she said. Pinocchio thought about the many wishes he could ask for, but he still only wanted one thing. I want to give Geppetto the perfect Christmas gift, he told the Blue Fairy. Something that he will love forever. The Blue Fairy smiled. She knew just what the perfect present would be. You are a very kind and loving boy, Pinocchio, she said. I'm sure Geppetto will treasure this gift for years to come. The next morning, Geppetto wanted to surprise his son. It was his greatest wish to make Pinocchio's first Christmas special. Geppetto went to place his gifts for Pinocchio under the tree. When he looked at the tree, he gasped. A wooden puppet hung from the branches. It wore a pair of red dungarees and a red feather in its cap. It looked just like his son. My dear Pinocchio, Geppetto said with a smile. It looked just like a puppet he had made a long time ago. He thought back to the lonely night when he had made a wish on the wishing star. He'd hoped that the puppet he was making would turn into a boy he could love. The blue fairy had granted his wish, and Pinocchio, the wooden puppet, had turned warm and loving. He'd become Geppetto's son. When Pinocchio heard his father moving about, he and Jiminy ran downstairs as fast as they could. Merry Christmas, they cried. Geppetto sat in his favourite chair holding the puppet. My gift, how did you make it? Pinocchio stared at the copy of the puppet. He'd been just like that once. He smiled. The blue fairy had chosen the perfect present for his father. Puppet Pinocchio was my favourite creation, Geppetto said. Oh, how I've missed him. Pinocchio felt a frown appear on his face. You have? He asked. Have I disappointed you? Geppetto laughed. Not at all, son. You've been perfect in every way. This toy reminds me of how very much I wanted a real son. It reminds me of how happy I am to have you. Pinocchio smiled as relief flooded his body. He went over to the puppet and looked at it closely. It was like looking into a mirror. The puppet had the same dark hair and blue eyes that he did. Geppetto started dancing with the puppet and singing. Geppetto looked at his son and said, No one has ever thought to give me a toy of my own to play with before. You understand how much I love toys, Pinocchio. Thank you. Pinocchio went over and danced beside the puppet that looked so much like him. Geppetto held out the strings for Pinocchio so that he could try to make the puppet dance for himself. It was difficult because the puppet was the same size as Pinocchio, but he didn't care. He was happy to share this moment with his father. A little later, Pinocchio opened the gifts that Geppetto had placed under the tree for him, but the best present that he'd received had come from the Blue Fairy. He would never forget the smile that lit up his father's face. He hoped that they would share many more happy Christmases together. Alright, got another one. Vanellope von Schweetz, president of Sugar Rush, lay down in a drift of powdered sugar. Ralph, watch this, she called to her friend. Ralph was visiting from his own video game, Fix-It Felix Jr. Vanellope moved her arms and legs quickly through the fluffy powder. Then she sprang to her feet. Ta-da! A sugar angel, she exclaimed proudly. Ralph smiled weakly. Oh yeah, nice one, he said. Vanellope could tell something was bothering Ralph. Hey, shouldn't you be Mr. Holly Jolly? It's only a few days until Christmas, your first real Christmas. The festive period was usually pretty lonely for the video game bad guys like Ralph. But ever since Ralph had saved his game from being unplugged, the Nicelanders had realised what a good guy their bad guy was. For the first time ever, they had even invited Ralph to their Christmas party. It was great to go to the Nicelanders' party, Ralph admitted. But you know what? The whole time I was there, I couldn't stop thinking about the bad guys in all the other games. Their Christmas will be just as lonely as ever. Ralph remembered past Christmases spent alone on his brick pile. Bad guys deserve a real Christmas too. Vanellope tilted her head to one side, then nodded. You're right, she said. And we can give it to them. She remembered how bad it felt to be left out by the other racers in her own game. Let's throw the bad guys a Christmas party with presents and a tree, the whole 9 yards. Ralph's face lit up. That's a perfect idea. He hopped up in excitement, then landed with a boom. The ground shook and a towering sugar drift toppled over, burying Vanellope. Oops, sorry, said Ralph, digging her out. Ralph called a special meeting of the Bad Anon support group. Every year, we bad guys get stuck on the outside of Christmas. Well, this year, everything is going to be different. Ralph told them all about how wonderful Christmas could be, with decorations, presents, songs, and parties. Everyone was really excited. Ralph's Christmas sounded like so much fun. I want everyone to meet here in the support group room on Christmas Eve, said Ralph, and get ready for the merriest Christmas ever. Ralph and Vanellope got busy making a special gift for each bad guy. They planned something for everyone, including a new fireproof cape for Satine, 8 cozy mittens for Cycloptopus, and a jar of extra sticky toffees for Zombie to reattach his arms. And now for the tree, said Vanellope. It just isn't Christmas without a tree covered in sweets. They found a perfect lollipop tree in Lollystick's forest. Then they strung it with popcorn garlands and hung candy canes on its branches. A glistening rock candy star twinkled on top. Not bad, said Vanellope, stepping back to admire it. Ralph agreed. It didn't exactly look like the Nicelanders' Christmas tree, but he knew the bad guys would love it. Now there was just one day left until Christmas Eve, and Ralph was worried about something. How are we going to carry all this to the support group room? Vanellope wrinkled her nose as she thought it over. Then her eyes widened. The same way Santa does, she replied, in a sleigh. Vanellope dragged Ralph across Sugar Rush to the Cart Bakery. There they could use all the sugar, icing, and sweets they needed to create the perfect Christmas cart. Has anyone made a sleigh before? Asked Ralph. I doubt it, but there's a first time for everything, Vanellope replied, as she fiddled with the controls. Gears turned, belts rolled, mixers mixed, and icing iced. Within minutes, a gleaming vehicle slid out of the finisher and came to a rest at Ralph's feet. One rocket-powered candy sleigh ready to go, Vanellope declared. On Christmas Eve, the two friends met to bring Christmas to the bad guys. Vanellope came dressed and ready to play an elf. I didn't have a hat in size freakishly large, so I made you this. She tossed Ralph an empty sugar sack tied with a red bow on the side. How about I get us off the ground, said Vanellope. She shooed Ralph into the passenger seat. You can turn on the rockets once we get going. Vanellope revved the engines and they were off. Soon they were flying smoothly towards the game exit. Okay, let's get this thing moving, Ralph called out, reaching for the left and right rocket switches. He flipped them both, but his powerful grip snapped one of the tiny rocket switches like a toothpick. Only one rocket turned on and the sleigh spun out of control. Vanellope tried to regain control of the runaway sleigh, but no matter what she did, it was no use. The rocket spiraled lower and lower until gloop. It came to a lurching stop in the middle of Great Caramel Lake. Ralph and Vanellope managed to swim to the shore, but the sleigh and all the presents were ruined. Ralph watched sadly as everything they had worked on sank beneath the caramel lake. Empty-handed and covered in caramel, Ralph and Vanellope made their way to the support group room. Ralph hesitated. What are we going to tell the guys? I've wrecked their Christmas. The crash had been an accident, but Vanellope was still sad they wouldn't be able to have a Christmas party. Time to face the music, big guy, she said. But when they opened the door, the friends' jaws dropped. The room was completely decked out, and the party was well underway. The bad guys greeted them with a big cheer. Where did you get all this? Asked Ralph. We spent the last few days getting everything ready, Sorceress said. Yeah, you got us all in the Christmas spirit, Satine added. But Vanellope and I made presents, decorated a tree. We even made a sleigh, but I wrecked it. I wrecked everything, said Ralph, sadly. Don't be silly, said Satine. You're the reason we're here, spending Christmas together. That's a pretty great gift. The other bad guys nodded in agreement. A wide smile spread across Ralph's face. Merry Christmas, everyone. They all celebrated late into the night. It truly was the merriest Christmas any of them ever had. I've got a bunch more of these books. I'll show you all the ones I've got. I'm going to be reading them all. Disney, Mickey's Christmas Carol, Bambi, The Wonderful Winter Tree, Robin Hood, Christmas for Everyone, Wall-E, A Gift for Wall-E, 101 Dalmatians, The Puppy's First Christmas, Spider-Man, Seeing Spots, Avengers, Wonders of Wasp, Avengers, Make Way for Widow, Guardians of the Galaxy, Lost Precious Thing, Spider-Man, Shock and Awe, Spider-Man, Laundry Day, Avengers, Monkey Business, Avengers, Loki, Mickey and Minnie's Gift of the Magi, Disney Encanto, Mystery in the Rainforest, Marvel Avengers, The Asgardian Prince, Disney Mickey's Christmas Carol. Oh, I think that's the first one again, right? Is that the first one again? Wait. Robin Hood, Christmas for Everyone. I don't remember that one. Oh, I don't know. I think I've gone back to the start again. Yeah, I think so. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, there's all those books to read. I just found those yesterday. And I was looking at them. And I know they're just kids' books. But I wanted to read them, to be honest. So I'm going to read them. And then I'm going to give them to the charity shop. And then go back to reading what I was reading, which is the story of Jimi Hendrix. That book. This book. Which I'm about halfway through now. I would like to just sort of rattle through that book. Finish that one off. Maybe I should give it a go now. Hang on. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to see how far I can get through this Jimi Hendrix book before I go to the shop. And then I'm going to head to the shop after that. It's Friday. Yeah, so the shop's open pretty late. I know which shop I'm going to go to. I'm going to go to the Tesco. Anyway, I'm going to read some of this book again. I've been enjoying this one so far. It's been pretty good. Jimmy didn't like having him around on the road either because Chaz was still trying to tell him what to do. As the journey finally began tailing off, Chandler returned to London, where he was supposedly in charge of Mike Jeffries' office. But he hadn't any interest in running an office. He preferred being in the pub down the street. When Trixie next came over from New York, she found a scene of devastation. The phones had been cut off for non-payment of bills. The furniture, which Jeffrey had always preferred to hire rather than buy, had been repossessed, and as a result of other long outstanding debts, bailiffs were all in the process of distraining everything that was left. As she watched, one of them picked up a filing cabinet and dumped its contents, crucial paperwork relating to Jeffrey's artistes, including Jimmy, into a heap on the floor before removing it. The bailiffs had no objection to her rescuing the documents, which are still in her possession as her employer never asked for them back. Jeffrey had long been seeking a pretext to cut Chandler loose, and this was it. He told Jimmy the management partnership was no longer working and he must choose between them. Despite all that Jimmy owed to Chandler, it did not seem to cause him any great heart-searching. One day Chaz came in with a face like thunder, Trixie recalls. It was a huge shouting match between Mike and him. Then he went storming off and Mike said to me, "That's it, he's out." Chandler sold his interest in Jimmy for £300,000, equivalent to around £3 million today. His 2 years in the entrepreneurial Super League provided to have been no one-off fluke. He went on to discover and manage the Wolverhampton band Slade, who had a run of hit singles in the early 1970s, to buy the famous IBC recording studios in London, set up various record labels and management companies, and co-founded a 10,000-seat sports and performance arena in his native Newcastle. Yet walking away from Jimi Hendrix would always be considered on a par with Sam Phillips selling Elvis Presley's contract to RCA Records for $50,000, or Andrew Oldham handing the Rolling Stones to Alan Klein for a bargain basement $1 million. And to Chandler's dying day, in 1996, aged only 57, he never quite got over Jimmy's rejection. The demise of the Jimi Hendrix experience happened more slowly, with several temporary reprieves along the way. Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell were shocked and upset to lose Chandler, whom they both had liked and trusted without any prior consultation with them. Their morale was already at rock bottom, exhausted by the pitiless travelling and the monotony of playing what Redding would recall as sloppy repeats of old hits, as we stared at the audience with dead eyes. Redding in particular had grown increasingly bitter over the little exposure he received as a songwriter and vocalist within the experience. As a protest, he had put together his own band, Fat Mattress, which he proposed to front while continuing to back Jimmy. To complicate matters still further, Chaz Chandler was currently trying to get Fat Mattress a record deal, and at some shows they would open for the experience, putting Redding on stage for twice as long as Jimmy. He himself offered no objection, though covertly mocking them as Thin Pillow, and Jeffrey, indifferent to the music side, as always, just let it happen. Redding and Mitchell fulminated behind Jimmy's back about his unpredictability on stage, the moodies when he could barely be bothered to hit a chord, the drugged trances when he was barely capable of it, and his habit of buying musical instruments for his hangers-on, then charging them to the band's account. Yet he could always disarm them with a sweetly apologetic handwritten letter or a performance touching new levels of brilliance. He was less sensitive to their feelings at the Record Plant Studios in New York, where the most important sessions for Electric Ladyland had somehow been slotted in between the incessant shuttling back and forth across the continent and the Atlantic. Despite its industrial-sounding name, inspired by Andy Warhol's factory and state-of-the-art facilities, the Record Plant had a homely ambience and prided itself on being welcoming to musicians. Its co-founder, Gary Kellgren, was a gifted engineer who'd previously worked with the Velvet Underground and Frank Zappa, and a pioneer of psychedelic audio effects like phasing and flanging. Kellgren worshipped Jimmy, and happily made him his co-pilot behind the Record Plant's brand new Scully 12-track console. With Chaz Chandler gone, all restraints of time and expense disappeared. Takes were unlimited, and mixing and remixing one track could go on for days. To make him feel even more at home, and further swell the eventual $70,000 tab, Eddie Kramer, his former engineer at Olympic in London, was flown over to lend a hand. For most of the time, Jimmy's ease and self-assurance in the studio seemed absolute, but there was one area where all his hit singles and albums had created no confidence whatsoever. When time came to do the vocal for All Along the Watchtower, Robert Johnson-esque humility returned, and he insisted on retiring behind a 3-sided screen. Only 2 blocks from the Record Plant was New York's best-known musicians' hangout, The Scene. Usually Jimmy would come into the studio straight from the club, bringing along a crowd of friends for one of the impromptu jams he so adored, disrupting the scheduled session and pushing Redding and Mitchell even further to the sidelines. One night, when he appeared with Stevie Winwood from Traffic and Jack Cassidy from Jefferson Airplane, Redding complained that it was not a session but a party, and walked out. It was a somewhat empty gesture, since Jimmy had taught him to play bass in the first place, and could switch over to it without missing a beat. And party or not, the jam initiated a quintessential Hendrix track titled Voodoo Chili, in that first spontaneous version, but Voodoo Child in the formal one later laid down the following day. Electric Ladyland was finally released as a double album in the autumn of 1968. Electric Ladies was Jimmy's politer term for groupies, and the cover, devised by Track Records' Chris Stamp for a world still largely untouched by feminism, showed 21 naked women with the implicit suggestion that they were but a section of his permanent seraglio. Jimmy was meant to have been shown in their midst, but failed to turn up for the photo shoot. In fact, he hated the image, thinking it vulgar and tasteless. His own conception, discarded by Stamp, had been a photograph by Linda Eastman, soon to become McCartney, and his own earnest liner notes. Nonetheless, the album billed itself as produced and directed by Jimi Hendrix. Inside the gatefold was a double-width portrait of himself, flanked by minuscule ones of Redding and Mitchell, which did nothing for their sagging self-esteem. Despite a near overload of premium Jimmy, it puzzled contemporary reviewers who expected double albums to have a recognisable theme. Melody Maker spoke for many in calling its 16 tracks mixed up and muddled, though acknowledging All Along the Watchtower to be a masterpiece. Decades would pass before critic Robert Christgau's recognition of an oral utopia that accommodates both ingrained conflict and sweet, vague spiritual yearnings, held together by a master musician. Put more simply, psychedelia and the blues became one. Because of those Electric Ladies on its cover, many stores in the US refused to stock it or would display it only clothed in plain brown paper. It still reached number one in Billboard's Hot 100 and stayed on the chart for the rest of the year. In Britain, although the nudity caused less panic, it stalled at number 6. Some British critics jibbed at the double disc format, to which Jimmy replied he would have liked it to be triple. The old rapport between Noel, Mitch and himself could still revive, especially with Pot Smoke in the air. On 6th of January 1969, with the bizarre miscasting that still dogged them, the Jimi Hendrix Experience were booked to appear on a peak-time BBC television show named Happening for Lulu. Its eponymous star was tiny, bluesy-voiced Glaswegian, who'd had her first hit single with the Isley Brothers' Shout, but had since moved so far into the middle of the road that she would be joint winner of that year's Eurovision Song Contest. The programme went out live in black and white in front of a studio audience and was choreographed as carefully as only the BBC knew how. Jimmy was to perform Voodoo Child, Lulu was to join him in Hey Joe. Then they were to close the show by duetting the theme song from her new film, To Sir with Love, a sly reminder that her screen co-star was the African-American Sidney Poitier. In the dressing room beforehand, the trio took the opportunity to smoke a joint together. While it was being rolled, a lump of grass fell into the wash basin and disappeared down the plug hole. Redding would later recall how a BBC maintenance man was summoned to retrieve what they said was a valuable ring and was so concerned that he offered to dismantle the entire fitment. Amid that shared smoke was born the notion of an alternative happening for Lulu. The previous October, Jimmy had sat next to George Harrison at the Los Angeles Forum, watching one of the last performances by Cream, a power trio that had self-destructed far more quickly than the Experience. Jimmy must have had the actual idea, Trixie Sullivan says, but the three of them were in it together. Their spot opened with Voodoo Child, as arranged. Jimmy, a monochrome vision of puffy silk shirt sleeves and transfigured face, playing the intro that was his closest yet to a heavy metal concerto. Things began to come unstuck when Lulu, seated in the audience, began to announce the next segment, and a shriek of feedback silenced her. Hey Joe began, but before she could join him, Jimmy brought it to a halt. We'd like to stop playing this rubbish, he said, and dedicate a song to the Cream, regardless of what kind of group they may be in. We dedicate this to Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce. The three then launched into an instrumental version of Cream's Sunshine of Your Love, the song Jimmy had inspired Jack Bruce to write. When the floor manager gesticulated frantically at him to get back on script, his only response was an upraised finger. The tribute continued all through the time allotted to his duet with Lulu, and was still going as the end credits rolled. After so many months of slogging around America, the Experience were desperately in need of an extended break. Instead, Mike Jeffrey flung them straight into a 2-week European tour, kicking off in West Germany. On 12th of January, when they appeared at the Rheinhall in Dusseldorf, Jimmy was introduced to Baron Rainer von der Ostensacken, a flamboyant young aristocrat sporting side whiskers and a top hat. Of more immediate interest, however, was one of the party the Baron had brought to the show, 23-year-old Monica Dannemann. Blonde and athletic-looking, Monica had been mildly famous in her homeland as an ice skater at national championship level before an injury forced her to give up competitive skating for teaching. She and Jimmy fell into conversation, in which it can be safely speculated he mentioned his own exploits on the Queensway ice rink in London. Had ended up spending the night together. It appeared to be a Hendrix one-night stand like 1,000 others although Monica followed him to his next gig. In Cologne, he almost immediately moved on to the German supermodel Uschi Obermeier, with whom he was photographed being extravagantly affectionate outside Berlin's Hotel Kempinski. On 18th of February, the Experience were to headline at London's Royal Albert Hall, a first in a venue that previously witnessed some of Cream's greatest moments. The show was to be filmed for an American television documentary, never aired in Jimmy's lifetime, and also recorded for a live album Jeffrey hoped to put out before their end-of-year studio one aimed at the Christmas market. Despite the multimedia importance of the Albert Hall gig, Jeffrey was busy elsewhere and left its organisation to Trixie Sullivan. During the rehearsals, Jimmy was so plagued by technical problems that he asked Chas Chandler to come in and rescue things. With shaming generosity, Chandler agreed. Then on the night, as film cameras waited to turn over and tape spools to spin, Jimmy arrived at the Albert Hall, coked out of his head. I literally had to kick him onto the stage, Trixie recalls, but he was incapable of playing and the other two guys couldn't do anything about it. Finally, I went out there and said to the audience, "You may have noticed that Jimmy isn't quite up to it at the moment. I'd like you all to come back next week and we're going to do this concert again." The split with Chas Chandler meant that Jimmy and Kathy Etchingham's 2 years of flat sharing with Chandler and his girlfriend Lotta had to come to an end, but finding alternative accommodation in central London was no easy task. Landlords had by now become even more wary of renting to rock stars thanks to a crackdown by Scotland Yard's drug squad in the person of its self-appointed Witchfinder General, Detective Sergeant Norman "Nobby" Pilcher. In October 1968, Pilcher had busted John Lennon and Yoko Ono at the foursome's previous domicile, Ringo Starr's flat in Montague Square, deploying 7 officers and 2 police dogs and alerting the media in advance. Before moving in, mindful of Jimmy's tenancy, Lennon had had the flat swept clean of drugs, and he maintained that Pilcher's squad had planted the cannabis he was accused of possessing. That minor conviction, his first and only one, would haunt him after he moved to New York in the 1970s and had to spend years fighting against deportation as a subversive. The open season on Pop's First Division also inevitably hit Jimmy's friend and devout admirer Rolling Stone Brian Jones, who was raided at his Chelsea flat by officers climbing up its garbage chute and charged with possession of a lump of cannabis hidden in a ball of brown wool. Next on Pilcher's list came Eric Clapton, with whom Jimmy had got high in public so many times, though Clapton managed to escape by the back door of his Kings Road Eyrie in the nick of time, leaving his flatmates to face the music. It soon became clear that Pilcher had become addicted to the publicity he received as a collector of rockstar scalps, and had indeed been wont to plant evidence, just as Lennon and Jones and many other of his victims unavailingly claimed. In 1972, he would be convicted of conspiracy and perverting the course of justice and sentenced to 4 years' imprisonment. Yet Jimmy never seems to have featured on Pilcher's list, even though his next address was hardly inconspicuous. Before his return from America at the end of 1968, Kathy found an apartment for rent on the top floor of 23 Brook Street, Mayfair, one of a pair one of a pair of perfectly preserved 18th century houses a short walk from Claridge's Hotel and Oxford Street. The adjoining number 25 was a site of historical interest, having once been home to George Friedrich Handel, the German composer who, like Jimmy, had come to London for his genius to be properly appreciated. The owner of number 23, who operated a restaurant on its ground floor, didn't care who rented the upstairs so long as its £30 per week rent was paid regularly. Although the house was in the heart of the West End, its 200-year-old walls muffled almost all noise from outside. There were no other flats in the building and no other residential properties nearby, so Jimmy could play the guitar with the amp turned up as high as he liked. It was a real retreat, Kathy would recall, sitting in their old bedroom 50 years later. We could get away from everyone and all the madness. It was a proper home, where you got up in the morning and had a cup of tea. People did visit us, a lot of other stars, but we never had it packed out. Jimmy didn't really like that. If we wanted to be in a crowd, we went to the Speakeasy or the Bag of Nails. For someone looking the way he did, living in the wealthiest part of Mayfair brought occasional brushes with the police, though they were mild compared with those on his American tours. Returning home one night, he and Kathy found access to Upper Brook Street sealed off for the arrival at Claridge's of newly elected President Richard Nixon. Both of them were interrogated and suspicious looks cast at Jimmy's guitar case, but eventually they were allowed through the cordon. The couple's relationship had stabilised since the rows and plate throwing at Ringo's flat. Part of the reason was that Jimmy now openly acknowledged his involvement with Kathy to journalists instead of making her hide away in the bath. "She's my past girlfriend, my present girlfriend, and probably my future girlfriend," he told the Enemy. "My mother, my sister, and all that bit. My Yoko Ono from Chester." She had become his music in a gentler way than when a fiery exit after his complaints about her cooking had inspired "The Wind Cries Mary." The Experience's second single from Electric Ladyland, "Gypsy Eyes," was a reference to the Romany strain of her family and a declaration of commitment. "I found her, I ain't gonna let her go." Number 23 Brook Street brought out all Jimmy's love of domesticity and army-style orderliness. He enjoyed helping Kathy choose cushions and fabrics to brighten the flat slanting wood floors and panelled walls, and unusually for any man in that era, took an equal share of the housework. He was very good about tidying up and making the bed, she recalls, and he was always going round with the Hoover. It fascinated him that Handel had lived in the next-door house, not as a fellow transient musician like himself, but for 36 years, dying there in 1759. He bought albums of Handel's Water Music and Messiah and played them often, especially the latter with its exalting Hallelujah chorus. The building had no reputation for being haunted, but Jimmy was convinced he once saw Handel's ghost, describing how an old guy in a nightshirt and a grey pigtail just walked through the wall while I was standing there. Although Jimmy now had money, it did not stay with him long. If he earned £10,000, he regarded the whole amount as available to spend on clothes or records or lavish cash gifts to family members, friends, or even total strangers, like the two girls to whom he gave $3,000 to go shopping just to get rid of them. With never a thought of all the deductions that had to come out of it, at the same time he remained blissfully unconscious of the cost to him of accountants, lawyers, and litigation, like that involving his old PPX label boss, Ed Chalpin, in New York, and of bottomless tabs that so many other people made use of at clubs like the Speakeasy. Credit cards were still almost unknown in Britain, and most of his day-to-day expenses were paid out in cash. Jerry Stickles, the roadie, usually carried it, and Jimmy would just say, "Pay them, Jerry," then forget about it. Trixie Sullivan recalls an account that had been opened for him at Martin's Bank in Edgware, but he used it only for withdrawals, once sending Kathy there to collect £3,000, equal to around £30,000 today. He was totally unaware of and uninterested in whatever Mike Jeffrey might be doing with his earnings through the offshore Yamita company, the more so since Jeffrey had transferred operations to New York, and his infrequent moments of financial anxiety were quickly dealt with by Jeffrey. When Kathy discovered that the rent on 23 Brook Street had fallen into arrears, it wasn't long before Trixie appeared with a briefcase full of US dollars. For some time past, Jimmy had been following Noel Redding's example and keeping a diary. Despite his natural verbal gifts, this was little more than an itinerary, couched in an invariable tone of sunny optimism. The weather in New Orleans is beautiful. We played out there at Red Rocks and I had a lot of fun. This tour's a merry-go-round. Tomorrow it's Muncie, Indiana. However, at 23 Brook Street, he tape-recorded a spoken version of a song he'd previewed at the Royal Albert Hall, revealing a darker, more troubled side of himself than anyone around him could have imagined. In it, he likened his existence as a rock star to a room full of mirrors, without windows or a door, a labyrinth of images of himself stretching to infinity from which no escape was possible. It ended on a note of despair verging on the suicidal. What has the world to offer me except pats on the back? Somebody help me. Somebody please help me. Jimmy's relationship with Kathy had lasted this long mainly because of her remarkable tolerance of the sexual Olympiad which he conducted on the road in America and Europe, with which their domestic idyll at 23 Brook Street barely reduced. Most of these electric ladies remained unknown to Kathy, but there was one she found it increasingly difficult not to notice. This was Devon Wilson, the ravishing, light-skinned African-American whom Jimmy had first met in Los Angeles. From mere groupie, Devon rapidly progressed to being his drug scorer, then to an unofficial but crucial member of his American entourage. Often, she and Jimmy seemed more like brother and sister. They would tell each other of their sexual adventures with other people, Devon's as likely to have been with women as with men. Despite her deadly drug habit, she was bright and funny, seemed to know everyone and found numerous ways of making herself useful, from controlling the traffic through Jimmy's dressing room to arranging as well as participating in the threesomes he so enjoyed. She even followed Jimmy to London and insinuated herself into 23 Brook Street without Kathy having any idea who she was. She was just another visitor. I remember her sitting on the end of our bed while we were on it and serving us tea. Nor was this the only one of Jimmy's overseas bedfellows refusing to stay in a neat, discreet geographical compartment. In April 1969, Monika Dannemann, the German ice skater he'd met in Dusseldorf 3 months earlier, came to London on the off chance of running into him again. She did so easily enough at the speakeasy, and they spent another night together, unbeknown to Kathy. Kathy's tolerance might have been less elastic had she known that a woman she thought she'd dismissed from Jimmy's life during his first few hours in London still remained very much part of it. Despite the passage of 3 years and all those unnumbered females, though his bed, he'd never got over Linda Keith, who had first discovered him in New York and whom he'd called his blood brother. Their paths had widely diverged since then, but Linda recalls, there was always a sense between us that one day we'd solve all the problems we both had and finally get together. Their meetings were irregular and nowadays completely chaste. Once, a limo turned up outside my parents' house in North London and Jimmy was sitting in the back. We just went for a walk, then sat on a public bench and talked. When Jimmy and Linda first met, her boyfriend had been the second most important Rolling Stone, Keith Richard. Now it was the doomed one, Brian Jones. Brian's escalating drug use had obliterated his former instrumental brilliance. Its last time on show, the Vibra-slap in Jimmy's All Along the Watchtower, while his 2 drug convictions barred the Stones from touring America, their most profitable market. Yet, with a compassion of which few suspected them, his bandmates could not bring themselves to fire him. Linda had known Brian for years as a friend, but now their common dependency on drugs drew them together in an infinitely less healthy way. One evening in a club, they made a spur-of-the-moment decision to drive together to Marbella in Spain that night. When they returned, she moved into his Chelsea flat. Brian soon discovered Linda's feelings for Jimmy and made a joke, or so it seemed, of treating him as a rival, which Jimmy abetted with the shameless male chauvinism of the time. It turned into a silly competition between them, she recalls. They'd sit in a club together arguing about which one of them I'd be with by next Christmas. Jimmy sent me a present pretending it was from Brian, an awful woolen hat with a bobble, and another one from him, a beautiful Thea Porter caftan. Behind his seeming playfulness, Brian was crazed with jealousy of his former hero. One night at his flat, when Linda was going off alone to a Jimmy gig, he fed her an overdose of sleeping pills pretending they were amphetamines to keep her awake, then fled the premises. She was found, rushed to the hospital, and revived only with some difficulty. Then the Stones office put it out that I tried to kill myself for love of Brian. In March 1969, Jimmy was due to start another massive American tour, playing 29 cities in 10 weeks. Kathy, as usual, had no wish to go along, but she agreed to join him in New York for a few days beforehand while he was working at the record plant. She found him ensconced in the Pierre Hotel's luxurious garden suite, which up to then he'd been sharing with Devon Wilson, surrounded by the loudest, nastiest bunch I had ever come across. Many of the women were obviously whores, she recalls in her autobiography, and the men all appeared to be pimps and drug dealers with their cool shades and little cocaine spoons hanging round their necks like badges of office. Being at the record plant while Jimmy worked on tracks with his new obsessive perfectionism was as boring as hanging around backstage in Newcastle or Manchester, only the food had improved, and every attempt on her part to rid the suite of hangers-on and recreate some of the peace and seclusion of 23 Brook Street was coldly rebuffed. "These people are my friends," Jimmy told her. She put up with it until the day a man arrived carrying a sports bag and walking with a limp, because, as he explained, he'd recently been shot in the leg. He accidentally dropped the bag, which gaped open to reveal packets of white powder with a handgun laying on top of them. Kathy fled to seek refuge with Angie Burden, who was now divorced from Eric and staying in New York with a new man friend. The first flight home she could get went via Shannon in Ireland, involved 2 changes of plane, and was packed with nuns and priests who prayed aloud together when it hit turbulent weather. "I was so relieved," she recalls, "that I almost joined in with them." Chapter 13. These could be tricky times for someone who had done more than any musician of his race since Louis Armstrong to make audiences colour-blind. For as Jimmy rose to international fame, it was inevitable that he should find himself in the sights of the Black Power movement. Black Power rejected the pacifist doctrine of Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights pioneers, all those heroic men and women who had stood up to tear gas, dogs, and water cannon in the spirit of Mahatma Gandhi, and advocated vigorous, if necessary violent resistance to white persecution and injustice. It called on its followers to cast off the stigma of their enslaved past by reconnecting with their original African roots, even repudiate the Christianity that had sustained their shackled forebears and become Muslims. Above all, it urged them to awaken from generations of subservience and self-effacement, and in James Brown's words, to say it loud, "I'm black and I'm proud." Its most visible manifestation was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, a paramilitary organisation uniformed in black berets, leather jackets and dark glasses, and claiming the same right to bear arms under the Second Amendment to the Constitution as every white citizen. They also did social work like serving free breakfasts to underprivileged school kids. Afro hair was obligatory, promulgating the movement's slogan, "Black is beautiful." The US government's chief retaliatory weapon was a special unit of the FBI known as COINTELPRO, for Counterintelligence Program. Set up in the 1920s to combat any perceived threat to the nation's internal security and licensed to practice every kind of dirty trick to further its patriotic aims, assassination not excluded. High on COINTELPRO's list in recent years had been rock musicians and their corrupting influence over young Americans through drugs and promiscuity. In 1967, working with British MI5, it had scored a notable coup by planting an informer in a weekend house party given by Keith Richard, thereby securing the drugs bust that landed both Richard and Mick Jagger in jail, and so prevented the Rolling Stones from touring America in the foreseeable future. In the gales of racial turmoil since then, the FBI's director, J. Edgar Hoover, had ordered the unit to focus on the Black Power movement, and in particular the Black Panthers, as the greatest threat to this country's safety. All African Americans with high public profiles were expected to declare their solidarity with the cause, and many did. In Hoover's eyes, the very stars and stripes seemed sullied when, at the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City, sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos both gave clenched fist Black Power salutes from the winner's podium. The question had had little relevance for Jimmy in London, where racial unrest was a rarity always confined to its Brixton and Notting Hill districts, and the only revolutionaries were the young white people toward whom the 1960s were not merely benign but bountiful. To be sure, they could find nothing to protest about nearer than the Vietnam War, the virulence of their protests in no way moderated by the fact that Harold Wilson's Labour government refused any direct involvement in it. Opposed to the war though Jimmy was, his time in the 101st Airborne made him still think like a soldier, as he told Eric Burden when they heard the noise of demos outside the American embassy in nearby Grosvenor Square. He'd parrot the domino theory he'd been taught in the army, Burden recalls, that America had to be in Vietnam to stop the world being taken over by the communists. He did agree to a meeting with London's nearest to a black radical leader, Michael de Freitas, who called himself Michael X, after Black Power's charismatic young demagogue, Malcolm X, the first of its figureheads to have been assassinated. Kathy Etchingham went along too, and de Freitas, although born in Trinidad in the West Indies, received them in a room hung with Zulu spears and animal skins. But no induction into British Black Power followed. Instead, de Freitas berated Jimmy for cohabiting with a white woman, and the couple escaped as quickly as possible. Despite the support of other celebrities including John Lennon, Michael X's London Revolution fizzled out and returned to Trinidad, where he was hanged for murder in 1975. After 1968, as Jimmy began spending ever more time in America, he received regular invitations, which soon turned into exhortations to commit himself to his Black Panther brothers. But much as he sympathised with the movement, especially the black is beautiful part, his long languid body did not contain a militant corpuscle. He grew adept at deflecting suggestions from hefty brothers in black berets and sunglasses that he should renounce his slave name and embrace Islam, as the great heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali had famously done, to huge professional cost, or else call himself something more suggestive of his African roots. In fact, he was rather proud of his lineage back to the southern cotton fields, and always said he was more conscious of his Native American roots than his African ones. His friend Sharon Lawrence recalls how skillfully he handled those prickly panther emissaries, calling them bro and exchanging high and low fives with an enthusiasm that gave no hint of his yearning for the encounter to end. He did his best to stay neutral in the race wars, refusing an invitation for a fireside chat with President Nixon at the White House that would have made him the first black musician to be received there since James Brown, after calming the race riots that followed Dr. King's assassination. Even so, he couldn't altogether resist the glamour of the Panthers, a fashion as well as a political phenomenon, and Black Power's infiltration of soul music through the likes of Brown, Aretha Franklin and the Cheelites. One day in Greenwich Village, he bought a copy of the Panthers newspaper from a street vendor, a transaction that would have gone unnoticed had the vendor not shrieked, "That was Jimi Hendrix," after him. These minor racial thought crimes were augmented by misunderstandings or by Jimmy's unfortunate tendency to be flippant at the wrong moment. My brother was going through an airport security check, and they asked if he had anything dangerous in his bag, Leon Hendricks recalled. Jimmy said, "Only my machine gun." The cops beat him up for that. He was fooling around one time, hanging out of a window with an American flag in one hand, a rifle in the other, and someone took his picture. Then the Panthers asked him to go on a march, and Jimmy joked that if he did, he'd have to wear a football helmet for protection. That was twisted to make it sound like he was telling them to go out on the streets in body armour, all of which was more than enough to fall under suspicion as the Black Messiah that J. Edgar Hoover expected and had convinced the American government to expect to unleash bloody black revolution. Accordingly, COINTELPRO, file number 163259525, was opened on Jimmy, describing him as a well-known Negro entertainer and classifying him as of special interest. The file, in which Hoover took a personal interest, would eventually run to 34 pages, many of them subsequently redacted, that pious synonym for censored. However, the findings of COINTELPRO's sleuths proved disappointingly thin. It was the time of the Chicago 7 trial, when a group of white yippies, i.e. militant hippies, led by Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, stood in the dock for conspiracy and fomenting riot at the 1968 Democratic Party convention. The file noted how the Seven's huge legal bill was being paid through benefit concerts by their many musician sympathizers. Word is, it added with wonderful smeary vagueness, Jimi Hendrix has consented to appear in one. On 3rd of May 1969, the Jimi Hendrix Experience crossed from America into Canada to appear at Toronto's Maple Leaf Gardens. In Detroit, their previous stop, they had been warned to expect a drug search at Toronto International Airport, so the ever-practical Mitch Mitchell wore a leather suit he'd had specially made without pockets to advertise he had nothing incriminating on him. Sure enough, they were met by a contingent of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the fabled Mounties whose proud boast was that they always got their man, and given an exhaustive going over, not in private, as was usual, but in full view of the terminal crowds. The Mounties got their man yet again. A flight bag carried by Jimmy was found to contain what the official report described as 6 small packages inside a glass bottle. A mobile laboratory was called to the airport to analyse the package's contents and pronounce them to be hashish and heroin. The hash was only to have been expected, but the heroin seemed to astonish Jimmy as it did everybody with him. It was common knowledge in his circle that he tried smack a couple of times, but not been seduced by it. As he confided to Sharon Lawrence, he was terrified of needles and had met enough junkies to be aware of its ghastly consequences. Now he protested that the stuff in his flight bag had been planted, though by whom and at what stage of that day's short journey were inexplicable. Taken to the Mounties' headquarters downtown, he was charged with 2 counts of possessing illegal narcotics, then released on $10,000 bail pending a preliminary hearing on 19th of June. He was still allowed to do his show at the Maple Leaf Gardens that night, indeed made his way there with a Mountie escort. Unwisely flippant yet again, he joked from on stage about the bust, even made up a little mock operatic aria about it. The episode received almost no publicity in Canada or America, and none whatsoever back in Britain. The tour's publicist, Michael Goldstein, afterwards claimed to have bribed an Associated Press editor with a case of liquor to stop the story going onto the wires. However, it unleashed frenetic activity at the FBI through its Buffalo bureau, Jimmy having given his permanent domicile as New York, and brought an exponential growth in his COINTELPRO file. There it was alleged that the hashish had been found in his shaving kit, contradicting his claim that it had been slipped to him by a fan as a medication without his knowledge. A lengthy teletype exchange with the Seattle Bureau brought up his one previous conviction for taking a motor vehicle without permission as a 19-year-old in 1961, and planted the totally false assertion that further action by the Seattle police might still be pending. 6 days earlier, backstage at the Oakland Coliseum, he had been handed a note that did not contain the usual female invitation to sex. It was from Diane Carpenter, with whom he had lived in New York when he was nearly destitute, supported by her earnings as a teenage prostitute. Instead of avoiding her, as he could easily have done, and most in his profession would have, he sent word to Diane to meet him at the airport before he left for his next gig. There she produced a photograph of the child she claimed he'd fathered, a girl named Tamika, now aged 2. Jimmy made no attempt to dodge the issue, commenting, "She has my eyes," chatting to Diane until his flight was called, and taking Tamika's photo with him. Any fear of paternity proceedings was now blotted out by his 2 drug charges, the heroin one carrying a maximum prison sentence of 20 years. Sharon Lawrence knew about them thanks to her job with United Press International, and had resolved that if he really was on smack, she would end their friendship. Jimmy, however, vehemently denied it, nor did Sharon see any telltale sign of junkie squalor and self-neglect in the still meticulous young man who sorted magazines into two piles, news and music, moistened paper tissues to rub away the sticky rings of Coca-Cola bottles from tabletops, and preferred to do his own ironing of the ruffled shirts that to professional pressers represented the ultimate challenge. Likewise, she found him fully aware how many people were sponging off him, even though he could never be roused to do anything about it. He would recount with amusement how one fellow musician seeking a cash handout arrived by limo, then charged him for its hire. There was nothing junkie-like either in his affection for Sharon's mother, who was still young and attractive, but more importantly answered the yearning for domesticity that even his Brook Street roost with Kathy Etchingham had not satisfied. My mom was always one of the first people you went to see in LA, Sharon recalls. Basically, they were very alike, two lonely, emotional people. She'd drive him around and quite often take him to the airport when he left. Mom was a brilliant cook and always made sure to fix his favourite dessert, strawberry shortcake. Jimmy loved to watch her cook, and he always washed the dishes afterwards. His unease over the coming trial could not stop him using the drugs he habitually did, with LSD topping the list. On 23rd of May, he returned to Seattle, this time accompanied by one of his regular American women friends, Carmen Borrero. After openly tripping on the Center Coliseum stage, he felt an impulse to show Carmen around the scenes of his far-from-happy boyhood. A young male fan, waiting with an album to be autographed, found himself co-opted to chauffeur the pair in his beaten-up Volkswagen Beetle. Jimmy, with the experience, could now claim to be the world's highest-paid rock performer, although he could also be seen across a range of small clubs jamming for free. His show at New York's Madison Square Garden on 18th of May earned $14,000 per minute. On 20th of June, the Newport Pop Festival in Northridge, California, paid him a record $100,000 for a notably lackluster set, redeemed the next day by an onstage jam with assorted fellow artists including Eric Burdon and Buddy Miles. As time went on, it began to appear that the more lucrative the gig, the less Jimmy's emotional involvement, the more spontaneous the jam and the smaller the stage, the brighter his brilliance. In a review of his Maple Leaf Gardens performance in the issue that belatedly mentioned the drugs bust, Rolling Stone compared it to watching a bullfighter who's so good that no bull challenges him, and therefore there's no danger and therefore no suspense. The problem was that Jimmy hadn't simply tired of going on stage to play the same old shit. He'd also tired of doing it with the same old sidemen. The band that Chas Chandler had flung together around him had fulfilled his limited role perfectly well in Britain and Europe, but things were different in America, where so many great musicians clamoured to jam with him. In particular, playing with Jefferson Airplane's hugely inventive bass guitarist Jack Cassidy had shown up the limitations of Noel Redding. Redding, of course, had been useful in other ways. His sense of humour had carried the experience through many a sticky moment. He'd been the most insistent that they should find out exactly what Mike Jeffrey was doing with those colossal earnings, and invariably acted as group spokesman, albeit with little or no effect. He had always felt a true regard for Jimmy's open and loving mind, and now was appalled to see that mind progressively addled by drugs and the psychological pressure from all sides, management, audiences, courtiers, mistresses. He was being pulled so many ways, it's a wonder he held it together for so long. Redding's autobiography, Are You Experienced, describes going into their dressing room trailer at the Newport Pop Festival to find about 8 black heavies who dwarfed Jimmy. He looked petrified, and I was chilled to the bone by his appearance. I really hated those people who only worried that someone else was sucking his blood and they wouldn't get their cut. Signs of Jimmy's restlessness were there to see during early 1969. In press interviews, he talked about taking a whole year off from performing and recording, writing songs for a different band, even returning to an idea he'd mentioned to his brother Leon, perhaps sharpened by George Frederick Handel's Ghost, and composing symphonies. In his mind, however, the Jimi Hendrix experience and the racial mix that had been imposed on it were already history. Unknown to Redding or Mitch Mitchell, he had got back in touch with Billy Cox, his old buddy and protector in the 101st Airborne Division and bandmate in the King Casuals. As payback for innumerable kindnesses, Jimmy had wanted Cox to come with him to London in 1966 before Chas Chandler decreed white side men only, but Cox at the time was too much on his uppers to accept the offer. I told Jimmy, I've only got 3 strings on my bass and the 4th is tied in a square knot, he recalls. Jimmy said, well, I'll make it and I'll send it for you. I'll make it and I'll send for you. In the interim, Cox had moved house and changed phone numbers, and Jimmy knew only that he was living next door to a television repairman who had to be bribed to deliver a message to him. On 29th of June, the Experience appeared at the Denver Pop Festival, headlining over the Mothers of Invention, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Three Dog Night and Joe Cocker. When Noel Redding arrived, several co-performers looked at him in surprise. Are you still in the band? Asked one. I heard that Hendrix has replaced you. The performances took place in Denver's Mile High Stadium, aptly enough since Jimmy took the stage almost levitating on his favourite acid, Owlsy Purple. Angry that the festival wasn't free, its 17,000-strong audience ran amok and were met by police armed with tear gas. As it eddied towards the stage, Jimmy said, I see some tear gas, that's the sign of the Third World War. A couple of numbers later, without forewarning Redding or Mitchell, he announced, this is the last gig we'll ever be playing together. Afterwards, in the continuing mayhem, the trio and their roadies fled the stadium in a 2-ton metal truck. Their pursuers pounded on the sides, and so many piled onto the roof that it started to cave in. Certain they were about to be crushed to death, they linked arms and shook hands, and Noel Redding, ever the joker, vowed that if he survived, he was getting on a plane home and never coming back. Actually, he was being serious for once. He did survive and did get on a plane home and didn't come back. That seemed to be the finish of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. From here on, Jimmy's London period was as good as over, and his relationship with Kathy Etchingham definitely so. He kept in touch with Kathy for a while after her exit from the Hotel Pierre, but his phone calls grew more infrequent and eventually ceased altogether. Kathy made no attempt at a reconciliation. She had been thoroughly frightened by the attach case full of drugs and the handgun in Jimmy's suite at the Pierre, and a resolve to break away hardened as her best friend, Angie Burden, descended into addiction that would prove fatal. The Brook Street flat was in Kathy's name, and she stayed on there alone for a while, diverted by her many musician friends, like Dave Mason from Traffic and the dependably demented Keith Moon. My affair with Jimmy was certainly the most important I had had, but there was no reason to be surprised that it was drawing to an end, she recalls. After all, I was still only 22 years old. Meanwhile, big things were afoot for Jimmy in New York. Mike Jeffrey had taken over the lease of a basement club named Generation at 52 West 8th Street, where Jimmy had often played with friends like Junior Wells and Buddy Guy. Planning to relaunch it as a psychedelic grotto, Jeffrey hired a young architect named John Storick, only recently graduated from Princeton, who also happened to be an aspiring musician. Storick's blueprint for the new club included a small recording room for the use of its performers. Then the engineer Eddie Kramer came up with a radical alternative. Rather than go on paying studio fees, which had reached an astronomical level with the Electric Ladyland album, he suggested it was more economic in the long run to build Jimmy a full studio of his own. Jeffrey agreed. The club idea was scrapped, and in late 1968, Storick had set to work on what would be the first recording facility ever tailor-made for a specific artist. In a nod to the album, whose Sky High tab helped bring it into being, and Jimmy's politer term for groupies, it was to be called Electric Lady Studios. On the 3rd of July 1969, Brian Jones, his great admirer and Kathy Etchingham's and Linda Keith's former lover, was found dead in a Sussex garden, aged 27. Now finally ejected from the Rolling Stones, Jones had bought the former home of A.A. Milne, author of the Winnie the Pooh series stories, whose 1920s whimsy seemed at the furthest possible remove from rockstar depravity and excess. Jones adored the Pooh books and had introduced Jimmy to them. When not talking Muddy Waters or Elmore James, they would discuss the adventures of that bear of very little brain and his companions Christopher Robin, Piglet, and the mournful donkey Eeyore. Jones had been surrounded by the same kind of sponges and con artists that Jimmy was, yet had died alone in his heated pool despite being an exceptionally strong swimmer. His demise would stand as rock music's greatest unsolved mystery for the next 14 months. 2 days later, as a memorial to the person who had founded and named them, the Stones played for free to an audience of around 250,000 in London's Hyde Park. Mick Jagger's performance, in a frilly white garment like a little girl's party dress, began with a reading from Percy Bysshe Shelley's poetic elegy Adonais, but ended with the simulated fellatio of a bulb-headed hand mic that to some looked like yet another attempt to outdo Jimmy. He himself was currently trying to clean up his public image by appearances on America's two leading TV talk shows. On the 7th of July, his interlocutor was ABC's atypically young, hip, and intelligent Dick Cavett. Clad in what resembled a sky-blue mini kimono, he came across as both modest and witty. "You're considered one of the best guitarists in the world," Cavett began. "Oh no," Jimmy interrupted. "How about one of the best sitting in this chair?" He then played a new song, Isabella, in which there was a brief glimpse of Mitch Mitchell back behind him on drums. On 10th of July came the turn of NBC's Johnny Carson show, but with a guest host, the black stand-up Flip Wilson, also featuring Nina Simone, Wilson Pickett, and Joe Tex. It was a major breakthrough in a medium that had always been queasy about showing African-American musicians live. In sardonic reference to their victory, Wilson had positioned a large watermelon on his host's desk. This time, Jimmy spoke of his belief in music as a religious experience, of more value than politicians telling you hogwash about this and that, and all this violence, people running around the streets. I can see their point, but music is like a church, like going to a gospel church. Afterwards, he introduced my new bass player, Billy Cox, and the old army buddies played Loverman in memory of Brian Jones. He was moving upmarket in other ways too. At the scene, Devin Wilson introduced him to two exotically dressed young women named Colette Mimram and Stella Douglas, who are about to open a boutique on nearby East 9th Street in the new unisex mode. Jimmy, a unisex pioneer as a teenager in Seattle, was the first customer through their door. Colette had been born in Casablanca, and the boutique, which never did acquire a name, specialised in Moroccan fabrics as well as haute imports from London and Paris. Jimmy loved our clothes, especially the Moroccan stuff, and he took the same size as me, she remembers. He'd come into the shop every day to try things on or just hang out. Stella's husband, Alan Douglas, was a record producer in charge of the United Artists label jazz division and famous for having teamed Duke Ellington with Max Roach and Charles Mingus on the Money Jungle album. Regarded as one of the greatest piano trio works in jazz history, Douglas was someone else who saw the makings of a bebop genius in Jimmy and would play a major part in his recording history, albeit sadly not in his lifetime. Through Colette and Stella, he also become friendly with a wealthy young Manhattanite named Deering Howe, whom he'd met when Howe's yacht was rented for a day trip for the experience. Colette, Stella, and Deering, in the old-fashioned phrase, took up Jimmy, introducing him to good restaurants in place of the endless tour greasy spoons, stimulating him to talk about subjects outside music that had always fascinated him, like art and politics. They were the first people he had met in years who weren't out to exploit or con him. He became particularly close to Colette, but never in any uncomfortable or upsetting way for her. He was a perfect gentleman, she says, a sweetie. Now that the 1960s was starting to ebb away, they had finally caught up with Mike Jeffrey. The manager's former anonymous blue business suits and dark glasses were giving way to garish long-collared shirts and hipster flares. He had grown his sideburns, begun taking LSD, and even with the funds that were always at his immediate disposal, if not his clients, bought a house in Woodstock. This traditional haven for artists and writers 100 miles north of New York City had become one for rock's super elite also when Bob Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman, settled in the area. Dylan had soon followed, finding Woodstock offered the privacy he craved and a stimulus to his new country-tinged electric sound with the band in the recording sessions later known as the Basement Tapes. The band, in their turn, had rented a communal pink-sided house-cum-studio in neighbouring West Saugerties that named their debut album in their own right, Music from Big Pink. It was in the hope of Jimmy benefiting from this potent creative atmosphere that Jeffrey moved him to Woodstock, by now a generic name for a ring of hamlets as well as the town itself. For the process of forming a new band, Jimmy made no objection, for he still revered Dylan, even more so since receiving a privileged preview of the Basement Tapes, which were to be withheld from the public until 1975. Jeffrey did not stint on accommodation, renting him an 8-bedroom stone house in the tiny village of Shokan with 10 acres of grounds, a pool, stabling, and horses that were his to ride if he wanted. Dylan lived only a quarter of a mile away, but was still in seclusion after the motorcycle accident. 3 years earlier, that seemingly had ended his performing career. Billy Cox was not the only trusty old friend Jimmy called to Shokan for his new lineup. It also included Larry Lee, the big, amiable rhythm guitarist who'd worked with the two of them long ago in the King Casuals. Lee had just completed his military service in Vietnam and was about to register at his local unemployment office when Billy's phone call came. The two other recruits reflected Jimmy's feeling of liberation from the experience's power trio format, for both were percussionists, drummer Juma Sultan and conga player Gerardo Velez. He seemed to have fully absorbed the Woodstock spirit, telling one visitor he wanted only to write music about tranquility and beautiful things. But after a few days, without a word to his fellow musicians, and much to Jeffrey's fury, he vanished without a trace. Colette Mimram and Stella Douglas had gone to Morocco, Colette's birthplace, on a buying trip for their boutique, and their wealthy friend Deering Howe was due to join them there. On the spur of the moment, Deering invited Jimmy along. It took some covert arranging for, with his Canadian drug trial still pending. He had to get permission to travel abroad from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. His arrival came as an equal surprise to Colette and Stella. We were at the airport to meet Deering, Colette recalls, and all the people who came off the plane first were asking us, "Are you anything to do with that weird guy who was on our flight?" With that, the buying trip was scrapped. They rented an old Chrysler sedan and devoted themselves to entertaining Jimmy. The 9 days that followed were the only holiday he'd ever had, and unquestionably the most joyous time of his life. Brian Jones had discovered Morocco ahead of him and been entranced by the teeming souks or bazaars displaying carpets, copper and brass of every description, by the brilliant textiles, tiles and ceramics, especially in rich Berber blue, by the lingering influence of its former French colonists, by the air of mystery and intrigue in its hurrying hooded figures, mingled with the sense of freedom and permissiveness, long predating the 60s, by its couscous and tagines and mint tea in little glasses, above all by the live music played spontaneously in streets and squares on all kinds of unrecognisable stringed instruments. For Jimmy, knowing he was in North Africa, and so connected to all this, however remotely, magnified its delights 1,000-fold. He was especially charmed by the medieval town of Essaouira, formerly Mogador, on the Atlantic coast, and the crumbling watchtower known as Borj el Baroud, on a broad stretch of sand nearby. In years to come, a wishful legend would arise that he'd been inspired to write castles made of sand there. Nor did his reluctant return alone to the States on 6th of August quite end the adventure. Waiting for a connecting flight in Paris, he encountered Brigitte Bardot, the French film actress who during his adolescence had indisputably been the world's sexiest woman. Their 2-day off-the-radar affair added Jimmy to a roster of Bardot conquests that had included his first French fan, Johnny Hallyday. Only one thing marred the vacation. In Morocco, I took Jimmy to meet my grandfather, Colette recalls. He was very old-school French and didn't approve at all of me being with Jimmy, but he'd recently married to a younger woman who was a clairvoyant and who got Jimmy immediately. "He's a genius," she said. "You can tell by his forehead." And she told me, "A year from now you won't be friends with him anymore." I assumed that meant he would have found another woman, but Jimmy seemed to see another meaning in it. Then she read the tarot cards to look into his future, and the death card turned up. After we got back to the States, he kept saying to me, "Only 8 months left, and only 6 months left." I asked what he meant, and he said, "I'm going to die before I'm 30. Chapter 14. After the light and freedom of Morocco, to say nothing of being bedded by Brigitte Bardot, it felt like a chore for Jimmy to return to rural upstate New York, make his apologies to the new band he'd left in limbo, and go on trying to turn it into a successor to the Jimi Hendrix Experience. He had brought its four members together without a thought of how they would function as a unit. Billy Cox and Larry Lee, his old friends, were down-home R&B men from Tennessee. Juma Sultan and Gerardo Velez were from sophisticated New York jazz-funk circles, and both of them percussionists. A hard-driving musical director like his fellow Garfield High School alumnus Quincy Jones might have welded the disparate elements together. Easygoing, egalitarian Jimmy couldn't, and never would. Nor did the Woodstock area's beauty and seclusion promote any of the creativity it had for Bob Dylan and the band. Seeing Essaouira and the Atlantic coast had made him even less inclined than before to country rambles and communing with nature, though he did gamely try riding one of the horses that came with the rented house in Shokan and managed to stay in the saddle. Jimi Hendrix on horseback in full costume is as treasurable a thought as him on the Queensway ice rink in London. Mike Jeffrey, whose house on Woodstock's Wiley Lane was only a couple of miles away, hovered constantly in the background, still fuming over Jimmy's Moroccan escapade and fretting over the loss of his touring income, his choice of new sidemen, and their all too obvious lack of progress. The new sidemen were uncomfortably aware of the strained atmosphere between Jimmy and Jeffrey, on whom, with his cash payouts at live shows suspended, he was now completely reliant for money. The temperature used to drop by about 10 degrees, Gerardo Velez recalls. Every time Mike came into the room, Claire Maurice, a cook who worked for Jimmy and his retinue, later claimed he'd told her he was trying to get free of Jeffrey's management. Every musician in the district, hearing that Jimmy was there, dropped by hoping for a jam with him and always got one, but the Shokan house was to produce no equivalent of Dylan and the band's basement tapes. The nearest was a bootleg recording by local keyboard player Mike Efron, credited to Jimi Hendrix, Juma, Mike and friends, and sold by mail order for $5. Like Colette Mimran's clairvoyant step-grandmother in Morocco, Efron's girlfriend had a premonition that Jimmy would die before he was 30. Feeling he needed rescuing from Jeffrey, the couple even discussed kidnapping him and taking him to a safe house in the district. Other people would soon have the same thought, although not with the same benign intent. With Jimmy still pondering over what to call the new band, Jeffrey had already arranged their live debut at a conveniently accessible event. This was the Woodstock Music and Arts Fair, beginning on 15th of August 1969, billed as an Aquarian exposition, but actually a 3-day pop festival, seemingly no different from others that had been taking place all over the country. It represented the most elastic use of Woodstock's name to date, since the site was actually 43 miles to the southwest, a 600-acre dairy farm at White Lake near Bethel. One of its co-promoters, the youthful Michael Lang, had been involved in the Miami Pop Festival, where Jimmy had made a notable appearance the previous year. Finding him now so near at hand seemed a lucky break to Lang, who, swallowing hard, agreed to Jeffrey's price of $32,000 for him to headline and close its final day. To Jimmy's great disappointment, Woodstock's most famous musical resident would not be among the cast. Bob Dylan had been preemptively booked to perform with the band at a concurrent festival on Britain's Isle of Wight. But even without that logical headliner of headliners, Lang warned Bethel's local authority to expect a crowd of up to 50,000. Early in August, with the Woodstock Festival looming and the band still struggling, Jimmy decided to send for Mitch Mitchell, who'd continued to back him after Noel Redding's departure, but had since returned to Britain. Checking into the already crowded Shokan house with his girlfriend, Mitchell thought the new lineup a shambles, and that increasing its percussionists to 3 by adding his lone white face would not be much help. After he'd rehearsed with them for 10 days, he recalls in his autobiography, they were probably the only band I've ever been involved with that did not improve over that time. I got the feeling that Jimmy simply wanted to get through the Woodstock gig and start again. At one point, he got so frustrated that he hurled his guitar across the room. But at least the band now had a name, referring back to his belief in music as a religious experience. And because the house stood atop a steep hill, Jimmy first chose Electric Sky Church, but then, for no particular reason, changed it to Gypsy Sun and Rainbows. The Woodstock Festival's programme, meanwhile, had grown to 32 acts, including Joan Baez, Arlo Guthrie, Richie Havens, Sly and the Family Stone, Tim Hardin, Canned Heat, Creedence Clearwater Revival, The Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, Jefferson Airplane, Santana, The Who, the Jeff Beck Group, Blood, Sweat and Tears, Joe Cocker, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Iron Butterfly. 10 years after, John Sebastian, Ravi Shankar, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band and Johnny Winter. Tickets, $7 per day or $18 for the whole 3 days, were going at such a rate that the organisers now predicted a crowd of 100,000. In the end, such hippie multitudes descended on Farmer Max Yasgur's rolling cow pastures that the organisers soon gave up trying to sell tickets and declared it a free festival. The final total would be between 400,000 and 500,000, the largest crowd for a music event ever recorded, arguably the largest convened for any purpose other than fighting battles. So inadequate were the boundary fences that the organistas soon had no option but to declare it a free festival. Despite being held in late summer, normally a glorious season in those parts, there was heavy rain which caused lengthy delays in the running order and eventually turned the site to a quagmire reminiscent of the Great War's Battle of the Somme. In an age long before premium seating and glamping, most attendees lived in rudimentary tents, with only the most basic catering and toilet facilities. Yet the atmosphere was one of celebration and impermeable harmony. In the whole 3 days there was not a single reported instance of violence. Farmer Max Yasgur himself took to the stage to admit having expected all kinds of problems from this use of his pasture, much to his shame in hindsight. You people have proven something to the world, he said, that 500,000 young people can get together and have 3 days of fun and music and have nothing but fun and music, and I God bless you for it. Jimmy's climactic performance introducing Gypsy Sun and Rainbows on Sunday, 17th of August, was scheduled to start at 11 p.m. By this third day, the roads for miles around had become choked by parked vehicles, and performers were being ferried to the stage area by helicopter. No chopper had been provided for the night's headliners, however, so roadie Gary Stickles had to be sent out to steal a pickup truck from the huge available choice for an hours-long journey through the still miraculously good-tempered chaos. Jimmy and co. finally arrived backstage to discover the festival's running order had fallen so far behind there was no hope of them finishing it as per the programme. Michael Lang offered an earlier slot, but Mike Jeffrey, as usual employing far more frigid aggression than was necessary, insisted on his group being the last to perform, even though it meant waiting on site until the next morning. Since all the artistes' caravans were already taken, he and the new band were led to a small cottage about 3 muddy fields away, Mitch Mitchell would recall, and spent the rest of the night there freezing. They finally took the stage at 9 a.m. on the Monday morning, a time that the lowliest support band would have considered an insult. By then, the site was a sea of mud and the 500,000 crowd had dwindled to a mere 30,000 or so. Michael Wadley's Oscar-winning documentary Woodstock captures all the incongruity of that moment. Jimmy wearing a white fringed jacket by Charlotte Mimran and a red headband with the latest in his line of long-suffering white Strats. Behind him, 6 Marshall speakers in 3 giant stacks. In front, an audience whose colours seemed to have been rinsed away by the summer tempests until they resemble hippies no longer but the Victorian mudlarks who used to scavenge the banks of the River Thames. Things got off to a shaky start when the MC introduced the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and Jimmy delivered a lengthy correction which hardly stoked up excitement. Dig, we'd like to get something straight. We got tired of the Experience, and every once in a while we was blowing our minds too much, so we decided to change things around and call it Gypsy Sun and Rainbows for short. It's nothing but a band of gypsies. Yet in the 2-hour set that followed, almost half the 18 songs were Experience numbers he used to call Same Old Shit, Purple Haze, Foxy Lady, Castles Made of Sand, Red House, and a 14-minute version of Voodoo Child, with no perceptible embellishment from Gypsy Sun and Rainbows beyond a double helping of conga drums. New compositions like Stepping Stone, Isabella, Message to Love, and Villanova Junction could only sound like the Experience because the Experience had only ever sounded like Jimmy. To be sure, Woodstock virtually does away with the band, shooting him mainly in close-up and often from below, quivering white fingers on a tremolo arm, an ecstatic red-bound face framed by a lowering Monday morning sky that no one would ever want to kiss. As much as a celebration and show of strength by the counterculture, the festival was a protest against the Vietnam War. Its organisers had announced that buying a ticket automatically enlisted the purchaser in the anti-war movement. Several of its principal performers had delivered impassioned speeches on the subject, but thus far the most overt musical protest had been Country Joe McDonald's lampoon of the military draft. I feel like I'm fixing to die, Rag, with its delighted mass sing-along. Jimmy's inclusion of the Star-Spangled Banner toward the end of his set was in itself no surprise. He had played it several times before in shows and done an obvious rehearsal during a pre-festival jam at Woodstock's Tinker Street Cinema that included 2 members of Santana. But he had never played it quite as he did for those bleary, muddy hippies, slowed right down from its usual brassy bounce, punctuated by drawn-out vibrato, flights into double time, and long-dying falls erupted into a feedback cacophony that somehow mimicked the war's sounds. The whip of helicopter blades, the whistle of falling bombs, the whoomph of napalm, the screams of its shredded victims. The former airborne soldier also acknowledged the young conscripts being killed in their thousands by segueing into taps, the mournful bugle cry over a soldier's grave. You finally heard what the song was about. The New York Post columnist Al Aronowitz would later write that you can love your country but hate the government. At the time, in keeping with the moment, the applause was but desultory. For an encore, Jimmy began another new song, Valley of Neptune, and forgot the words, apologised, and fell back on that samiest of old shit, Hey Joe. His FBI file lists him accusingly among Woodstock's dramatis personae, expatiates on the amount of LSD consumed there, dwells with voyeuristic relish on the music's power to cause unrestrained and lewd behaviour among its spectators, yet makes no mention of the Star-Spangled Banner, possibly for fear of causing J. Edgar Hoover apoplexy. He walked off stage, Mitch Mitchell recalled, cold, tired, hungry, and unhappy with his performance. He would never know he had just created the defining moment of Woodstock, and many people believe of the whole decade. Jimmy's 2 regular female companions, as opposed to the countless irregular ones, continued to be Devon Wilson and Carmen Barrero. Each had her appointed role and was perfectly content to share him with the other. Devon was more like a personal assistant whose duties ranged from controlling the crowd around him, at which she was never very effective, to scoring his drugs. Latterly, she had persuaded him to try the heroin, to which she was long addicted, even though he was awaiting trial for possession of the drug in Toronto with a plea of not guilty. However, with his phobia about needles, he did not inject it and never took enough in powder or pill form to become dependent. Carmen was his public girlfriend on occasions when he needed one, like the last trip back to Seattle. She was in every way different from the amiable Devon, with a fiery temper and a penchant for unlocking the darkness that lurked in Jimmy, especially when he drank whiskey, most especially if he suspected one of his women of infidelity. A combination of both with Carmen led him to repeat the violence she suffered in Los Angeles. First, he tried to push her out of a window, then hit her with a bottle. After his return from London, the menage a trois increased to quatre. He had always kept in touch with Fayne Pridgeon, his mistress cum mentor during his first penniless days in New York. Now Fayne welcomed him back into her bed as indulgently as before, although surprised at the change in the kid with the processed hair who used to go at it so straightforwardly. Once I remember waking and Jimmy was tying my foot to the bed rail, she would recall in a mesmerizing 1982 interview with Gallery magazine. The other hand and foot had already been secured. Suddenly, he was like a total stranger to me. Despite these ominous preliminaries, what followed had no S&M element, but afterwards I became terribly angry when it became clear he had no intention of letting me loose. He pulled the cover up around my neck, kissed me on the bridge of my nose, and said he was going to a rehearsal. To Fayne, Jimmy had become like a speeding A-train heading for a wall. He felt it, we all felt it. Something was leading to a boom, some big bang. He often said he didn't know if he would make it to 30. Woodstock had increased Jimmy's discomfort about staying on the fence where Black Power was concerned. Performing for such a huge, overwhelmingly white crowd inevitably brought cries of Uncle Tom from the Black Panthers, just as it brought threats from redneck whites to beat him to a pulp if he ever defiled the national anthem like that again. The pressure was the greater because his new sideman, Juma Sultan, had links with the Panthers, as Gerardo Velez did with their Puerto Rican equivalent, the Young Lords. This pushed Jimmy to an interview in which he seemed to make the commitment the Panthers had sought for so long. I naturally feel a part of them in certain respects, he said, but everybody has their own way of doing things. It bothered him too that his black audience was still nowhere near the size of his white one, especially not here in New York. That became painfully clear one broiling hot day just after Woodstock, while he and Fayne were driving around Harlem in his Corvette with the top down. Some little kids were shooting water out of the fire hydrants and filling every car that passed. Fayne would recall, I told him to stop and turn around, but he said, no, they won't do it to me. I said, they will, they don't know you. Well, they wet us all up and filled his little Corvette with water. It came as a big shock to him that kids in Harlem didn't know who Jimi Hendrix was. Nonetheless, a campaign was afoot to help Hendrix finally win over Harlem. Its driving force were musician twin brothers Taharqa and Tunde Ra Alim, born Albert Raymond and Arthur Russell Allen, who had once shared an apartment with Jimmy and to whom he'd given their stage name of the Ghetto Fighters. How much clout the Alims had in Harlem was demonstrated when some local hustlers began advertising a Jimi Hendrix concert that Jimmy had never agreed to and knew nothing about. Walking along 125th Street with the twins one day, he saw a man in the act of putting up a poster for it. He angrily confronted the fly poster, who immediately summoned backup, and he found himself looking down the barrel of a gun. When Taharqa and Tunde Ra mentioned their connections in the neighbourhood, the gangsters backed off and nothing more was heard of the supposed concert. One can only wish he could have gone on enjoying such protection. The twins' first idea was for Gypsy Sun and Rainbows to play the Apollo Theatre, where Jimmy had once won the Friday night talent contest, as a benefit for famine victims in the short-lived tragic African state of Biafra. However, the Apollo refused to participate, fearing the event would be hijacked by white Hendrix fans from downtown. It was therefore decided to make the benefit for Harlem's United Bloc Association, which had some 3,000 young African American and Puerto Rican members and epitomised the positive and community-minded side of Black Power. Mike Jeffrey was aghast that no fee would be forthcoming, but the gig held such importance for Jimmy that he had to agree. It was to be a one-day open-air event on 5th of September with undoubted Harlem favourites Sam and Dave, Big Mabel and Maxine Brown in support. A few days beforehand, Jimmy gave a press conference at Small's Paradise, the 135th Street nightclub where he'd once struggled to be heard. Rather than his usual gaudy gypsy threads, he wore a black jalaba he'd brought back from Morocco, which made him look like a Benedictine monk. Inevitably, only one thing interested the press. Would this be a black Woodstock? I want to show that music is universal, that there's no white rock or black rock, he told the New York Times. On the afternoon of the show, he drove to Harlem in his Corvette with Carmen and Mitch Mitchell. They parked and set off for an exploratory stroll, leaving Jimmy's guitar on the back seat. They had gone only a short way when a group of teenagers broke into the car and made off with the guitar. The Aleem twins' connections had to be called on again to trace the thieves and recover it before showtime. The stage, strangely undersized and only about 4 feet high, had been sited on West 139th, facing down Lenox Avenue to create the largest frontal audience possible. About 5,000 people had turned up, but the atmosphere was nothing like Woodstock's. As the Apollo management had predicted, they included many whites from downtown who did not realise on what sensitive turf they stood. Carmen, with her dyed blonde hair, was mistaken for one of the interlopers rather than a Puerto Rican kindred spirit. Jimmy met with shouts of abuse for escorting a white bitch, and she had paper cups and other missiles thrown at her and her blouse ripped. She was scheduled to go on at midnight, straight after Big Mabel, who weighed 250 pounds and had a voice that could shatter a wine glass at 20 paces. Mabel's 96 tears and a whole lot of shaking going on set people a bop all down Lenox and in the windows of surrounding buildings. But when she refused to come back for an encore, booing broke out. Unfortunately, the first of Gypsy Sun and Rainbows onto the stage was Mitch Mitchell, the sight of whose white face redoubled the boos. When Jimmy followed, even his white trousers brought jeers and catcalls as if he'd purposely chosen them to proclaim his primary allegiance. And eggs and a bottle were hurled at the stage, putting the Aleem twins in real fear that their getting to know Jimmy exercise was about to turn into a riot. Jimmy responded by working as hard as if this were an open-air Apollo talent night, which usually guaranteed crowd pleasers like Foxy Lady, Red House and Fire. He included the Star-Spangled Banner, but deliberately eclipsed it by a version of Voodoo Child that he introduced as Harlem's national anthem. Nonetheless, the crowd down Lenox Avenue kept melting away during his set until at the end only a couple of hundred were left. The best face that could be put on it was his percussionist Juma Sultan's comparison with a sporting fixture which had ended in a draw. He would never have another chance to change that score. September 1969 found Linda Keith making a concerted effort to overcome her drug addiction by undergoing both electric shock and sleep therapy at St. Thomas's Hospital in South London, but hearing that Jimmy was to perform at the opening of a New York club named Salvation 2, she discharged herself from hospital and went over to see him. It was, as she describes it, another of their occasional little romantic flings, not in any way obstructed by Devon Wilson, with whom she remained great friends. Jimmy, she recalls, seemed depressed and anxious, but did not tell her why. It was as if he wished he could go back in time to when things used to be simpler. Salvation 2 was a new uptown version of a place in Sheridan Square, Greenwich Village, where in former days Jimmy had often played, then passed the hat around. Since then, like many clubs in the city, it had come under the control of the mafia. That was not in itself a worry. Many entertainers worked in places controlled by the mob. Indeed, it was almost impossible not to, and generally suffered no ill effects. What disquieted Jimmy was a growing suspicion that they now also controlled his manager. 10 days after Woodstock, Mike Jeffrey had turned up at the Shokan House in a chauffeur-driven limo, an unusual departure for someone who took pride in doing everything on the cheap. He had informed Jimmy that Gypsy Sun and Rainbows would be appearing at Salvation 2's opening, and to indicate that refusal was not an option, the chauffeur had produced a loaded revolver and began using a tree in the yard for target practice. Despite this coercion, the Gypsy Sun and Rainbow's indifferent performance on opening night, Jimmy was well treated at Salvation 2. The club soon became another venue for the late night jam sessions he could not live without, and its co-manager, Bobby Woods, was his main cocaine dealer, drawing on stock that the mob imported into Manhattan by the ton. He was therefore totally off guard when he left the club on foot late one night to score something other than its in-house coke. During the short journey, he was accosted by 4 men and whisked away in a car. His brother Leon maintains that the kidnap had been staged by Mike Jeffrey with the assistance of his new mafia buddies, to be followed by an equally bogus rescue that would leave Jimmy even more enthralled to him. Leon further believes that Jimmy barely noticed what was going on. He just went on smoking grass, playing his guitar and hanging out. But Trixie Sullivan, still Jeffrey's PA at the time, says it was completely genuine and Jeffrey was as appalled as everyone else. Mike got a call one afternoon and I saw him go deathly pale. He said they'd got Jimmy and a car was coming to pick him up and take him to where Jimmy was being held. He told me later he'd been driven to this place and in the middle of nowhere. He told me later he'd been driven to this place in the middle of nowhere, then down a long drive, and behind every other tree there was a man with a machine gun. Negotiations took place, and 2 days later Jimmy was returned to the house in Shokan unharmed, but Trixie recalls in shock. The episode never got into the papers and remained shrouded in mystery until 2011, and publication of a book titled American Desperado, My Life as a Cocaine Cowboy, by a convicted drug smuggler named John Roberts. In 1969, Roberts, then known as Rico Bono, had been a young mafia soldier based at Salvation 2. Jimmy, he claimed, had not been abducted by proper mafiosa but wannabe wise guys, desirous of getting into the music business either by muscling in on his management or simply extracting a ransom for him. According to American Desperado, Roberts and a colleague named Andy Benfante easily traced the kidnappers and told them, "You let Jimmy go or you're dead. Do not harm a hair on his afro." Once he was free, the wannabe wise guys were given a beating that discouraged them from any further ventures into the music business. Jimmy's watchers in the FBI naturally had developed a strong interest in Salvation 2, and Roberts had been forced to flee to Miami, there becoming involved with the Medellin drugs cartel and ultimately facilitating its importation of $15 billion worth of cocaine into New York. He changed his surname from Riccobono to confuse the feds when he fell under suspicion of whacking Jimmy's dealer, Bobby Woods, who was found shot 5 times in the head in 1971. A surreal postscript to American Desperado claimed that in addition to the kidnap rescue, Jimmy owed its author a literal salvation too. He had been wont to hang out at Roberts' beach house on Fire Island, where the old high school athlete resurfacing, he liked to water ski, no matter how stoned he was. One day, evidently in that condition, he collapsed into the water and would have drowned, but for Roberts' arrival in a speedboat with a rope. However, as a junior player in the kidnap drama, Roberts would have been acting on orders from above. From what Jeffrey told Trixie Sullivan, she deduced Jimmy's release had been arranged through his record company, Warner/Reprise, whose most valuable property he was at that point. And the idea that a company founded by Frank Sinatra should still have had a helpline to senior figures in the mafia cannot easily be discounted. Gypsy Sun and Rainbows lasted barely a month. Although Jimmy worked on several tracks with them at the record plant, there was never enough finished material to make a debut album. Their only national exposure came with Jimmy's second appearance on the Dick Cavett Show on 9th of September, when the burning topic was still Woodstock, and his interpretation of the Star-Spangled Banner, which he described as beautiful, with Cavett's smiling approval. Afterwards, with the lineup minus Gerardo Velez and Larry Lee, he performed a new song called Machine Gun, another soundtrack of the Vietnam War, this time in the guise of a sleepwalking blues whose impact was mostly lost by having to be cut to 2.5 minutes. Mike Jeffrey might have allowed the band to continue if they'd shown any sign of becoming good earners on the road. A nationwide tour had been arranged for them, starting in Boston on 18th of September, but a few days beforehand Jimmy cancelled it on the grounds that he did not feel physically or mentally capable of performing. The promoters, Concertways, had to be paid to $25,000 compensation, and Jeffrey decided enough was enough. Velez and Juma Sultan were persuaded to sign individual contracts with the Jeffrey offshoot company, aptly named Piranha Productions, the real object of which was to stop them working any further with Jimmy. Rhythm guitarist Larry Lee independently decided to leave, having always felt out of his depth, and Mitch Mitchell followed suit to spend more time at his new house back in Britain. Only Billy Cox stayed at his post like the old soldier he was, ready to play bass and provide Jimmy with other reinforcement whenever needed. The rented property in Shokam was vacated and given back to its owner in not quite the condition he'd last seen it. One of the bedrooms had been painted black, another required a mural of a flying saucer above a mountain, and there were burn marks and spilt wax from candles everywhere. Jimmy accepted the end of the band philosophically, moving back into New York City and taking an apartment on his own on Greenwich Village's West 12th Street. After spending all those months in Woodstock without a sight of Bob Dylan, he spotted Dylan in the Village one day while walking along 8th Street with his society friend, Deering Howe. Equal star though he now was, he introduced himself like the humblest fan. Mr. Dylan, I'm a singer, my name's Jimi Hendrix. Dylan, who could be such a curmudgeon, greeted him affably, belatedly praising his covers of Like a Rolling Stone and All Along the Watchtower, even recalling their first brief encounters years before at the Village's Kettle of Fish cafe. Jimmy, Deering Howe recalled, was on cloud nine. The word that Jimi Hendrix was seeking new sidemen quickly went around the top musicians, both American and British, who constantly passed through New York and without exception regarded an invitation to jam with him as the summit of their careers. In no time he was rumoured to be planning a Cream-style supergroup with Jack Cassidy from Jefferson Airplane and Steve Winwood from Traffic. Whatever new combination he settled on, the obvious favourite as drummer was Buddy Miles, the genial giant with the outsized afro, whom he used as an occasional session player and side main. Though Miles now had a band of his own, the Buddy Miles Express, Jimmy had maintained their connection, writing liner notes for the Express's first debut album, Expressway to Your Skull, and producing one side of their second, Electric Church. In the autumn of 1969, however, all this had to be put on hold when Jimmy's career took a totally unexpected but irresistible detour with another man named Miles. The latest British guitarist to offer a serious challenge to his crown was Yorkshire-born John McLaughlin, a pioneer of fusions between rock, blues, jazz and Indian classical music that would later come together in the Mahavishnu Orchestra. As it happened, McLaughlin had recently moved to New York to join drummer Tony Williams' jazz fusion band Lifetime. Mitch Mitchell, an old friend of McLaughlin's, was back in town and came to see Lifetime at the Village Vanguard. Afterwards, Mitchell invited him to a monumental jam with Jimmy as the still unfinished Electric Lady Studios that also included Buddy Miles. Jimmy, McLaughlin recalls, was one of the humblest and nicest people I ever met. McLaughlin's eclectic brilliance had also given him an entree into New York jazz circles, where he'd gone straight to the top by playing regularly with Miles Davis. Since the late 1950s, Davis had been to modern jazz what Jimmy now was to rock, a revolutionary stylist who refused to be put into any one category. He totally remade the form at regular intervals with a spare, melancholy trumpet style which, like Jimmy's guitar or the plays of Harold Pinter or Samuel Beckett, was all about pauses and spaces, and nothing that rowdy rock could do had ever diminished his aura as the quintessence of cool.
Off stage too, he broke the usual mould of the low-key, introverted jazzer with his wild, unafroed hair, with vast, gaudy wardrobe and expensive cars, his open contempt for white people, self-confessed misogyny and domestic violence, and sometime career as a pimp to support his heroin habit. By 1969, Davis was starting to experiment with rock and funk, even as Jimmy's solos were edging ever closer to Charlie Parker style bebop. Realizing what a brilliant fusion might be here, McLaughlin took him to a screening of Monterey Pop. In Jimmy's guitar burning scene, he could be heard softly exclaiming, "Damn, damn," for him the highest form of praise tinged with regret at never having thought of doing anything similar to his trumpet. Jimmy was thrilled to meet Davis, whose playing he had loved since Davis's seminal 1959 album Kind of Blue had been part of his father's jealously guarded record collection. As John McLaughlin had hoped, the two started jamming together, though only at their respective apartments, barely audible even in the next room. Davis, who had been trained at the Juilliard School of Music, was astonished by Jimmy's total ignorance of musical theory, and in some of their initial meetings attempted to instruct him on the subject. But he soon gave up, acknowledging that Jimmy's songs like "That Goddamn Motherfucking Machine Gun," another high Miles Davis compliment, were beyond any theorizing. The relationship was not easy, for the arrogantly racist Davis deplored Jimmy's wide acquaintanceship among white musicians whom, with a few exceptions like John McLaughlin, Davis considered an inferior species. One day, when the British singer Terry Reid answered the door of Jimmy's apartment, Davis refused to cross the threshold, growling, "I want fucking Jimi Hendrix to open Jimi Hendrix's fucking door." The two would occasionally double date, Jimmy with Carmen Barrero, Davis with his long-suffering woman friend of the moment. In contrast with Jimmy, Harlem accorded Davis the royal treatment it still denied Jimmy. When they visited Small's Paradise, he was shown to a special table in a curtained-off recess so that he and his guests could smoke a joint unobserved. The Jimmy-Miles fusion worked better than John McLaughlin had ever dared hope, and they began making plans to record together with drummer Tony Williams. For Jimmy, the only possible bass player was someone whose skill on the instrument tended to be obscured by his singing and songwriting and the sheer magnitude of his fame as 1/4 of the world's most beloved pop band. On 21st of October 1969, Davis, Williams and Jimmy together sent a telegram to Paul McCartney in London, inviting him to join them in a recording session to be produced by Alan Douglas. The timing could not have been worse. The appointment of the Beatles' new manager, Alan Klein, had caused a rift between McCartney and the other Beatles which had driven him into self-imposed exile on his Scottish farm and to something close to a nervous breakdown. The polite refusal from the Beatles' aide, Peter Brown, said he was on vacation. Nor did the session ever take place without him, for Davis and Tony Williams, seized with visions of rock and roll wealth, each demanded $50,000 up front, and Douglas cancelled it. The only record of the Davis-Hendrix collaboration, the most sublime jazz-rock fusion conceivable, were the tapes made in Jimmy's apartment, which have remained unreleased to this day. Jimmy spent the evening of his 27th birthday on 27th of October watching the Rolling Stones perform at Madison Square Garden on the American tour, which Brian Jones' death had finally made possible and which now had a special urgency since dumping Alan Klein as their manager had left the Stones owing huge amounts of UK income tax. As a privileged backstage visitor at the Garden, Jimmy appears briefly in Gimme Shelter, the film documenting a journey that would end 2 months later with the infamous free concert on Altamont Raceway and the fatal stabbing of a black audience member by Hell's Angels in full view of the band as they played. Amid the dressing room melee, he can be seen chatting amiably to Keith Richard as Mick Taylor, Brian's absurdly young and innocent-looking successor on lead guitar, stares at him with undisguised adoration. For the show itself, he was given a seat on stage behind Richard's amp, from which he might have expected to be called to sit in with the Stones, especially as this was his birthday. But Jagger was too wary of his special kind of sitting in to risk it. The after-show party was given by Devon Wilson in a luxurious duplex apartment she borrowed for the purpose. Ostensibly a birthday celebration for Jimmy, it was really to proclaim the success of a campaign to sleep with Jagger that had gone on all the time she'd been sleeping with Jimmy. At the party, both men went off to an empty room together, it was presumed, for some kind of fight over Devon. In fact, Jagger was showing the thoughtfulness of which he was sometimes capable. 7 months after Jimmy's drugs bust at Toronto International Airport, his trial was finally to begin on 8th of December. Mick made some amends for annexing Devon by offering advice on the coming courtroom ordeal based on his and Keith's experience in 1967. Jagger, however, still had no inkling of having been targeted by the FBI's COINTELPRO unit in league with British MI5, which had triggered the bust that landed them both in jail and so kept the Stones out of America for 3 years. In Jimmy's case, despite his having been under COINTELPRO surveillance for more than a year, the bust had been made by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Still, the FBI liaised closely with the Canadian authorities over his trial and made contingency plans with them in the event of an unsatisfactory verdict. Jimmy's file contained a memo dated 6th of November and, as usual, circulated to J. Edgar Hoover, saying that if he is found innocent of the charges, the Canadian immigration would like to deport him if it can be proved he has criminal convictions in the US. He prepared for his court appearance by having his hair cut and, on the advice of one of his defense attorneys, Bob Levine, buying a conservative dark suit which Levine recalled made the effortlessly stylish gypsy look like a hick, fidgeting around and trying to loosen his tie. During the limo journey to LaGuardia Airport for their flight to Toronto, Levine became uneasy about some items Jimmy was slipping into his guitar case to take through the same customs hall where all the trouble had started, but he insisted there was nothing inappropriate, adding with touching faith in his new respectable look, "Trust me, Bob, they'll never recognise me." They did, of course. The guitar case was searched, a capsule of unknown origin was discovered, and Jimmy spent the night in detention while it was analysed. His defence witnesses were to include the United Press International journalist Sharon Lawrence, who had come from Los Angeles despite a warning from someone close to Mike Jeffrey that Jeffrey wanted the trial to be a lesson to Jimmy and could turn very nasty with anyone seeking to obstruct that. As an example of someone who might help Jeffrey turn nasty, she was given a name which, when she made inquiries through journalistic channels, turned out to be that of a major street crime boss. She found Jimmy released from custody, the suspect capsule in his guitar case having proved to be illegal medication, and fretting in a luxury suite at the Royal York Hotel. Before she could speak, he warned there were 2 guys who he named as Jeffrey Associates listening on the other side of that door, and insisted they talk in the bathroom where no one could overhear them. He told Sharon he was terrified the heroin charge would result in prison, where he said he'd be dead in a week. At the same time, he couldn't resist telling her excitedly about meeting Bob Dylan that day in the village and what Dylan had said. His backup during the 3-day trial was impressive, although Sharon would never discover how much, if anything, the absent Jeffrey had contributed towards its costs. Heading Jimmy's courtroom team was one of Canada's leading attorneys, Henry Steingarten, and to handle the inevitable media storm, the veteran publicist Les Perrin, who'd done the same for Jagger and Richard after their trial, was brought over from London. Chas Chandler had also volunteered to be a defence witness, another demonstration of shaming generosity. Alright, we're going to have to stop there. Alright. So I went to the shop and I got mayonnaise, Hellman's real, some cheddar cheese, some more cheddar cheese, some more cheddar cheese, and some crumpets, Warburtons. I think that's all I got. Oh no, I got lemon juice as well. Oh, and a Monster, Rockstar. Yeah, I got this lemon juice, Mikado, Quality Foods lemon juice from concentrate, and I got, what does that say? Blueberry pomegranate Rockstar energy drink. So I need to turn the heating on. It's getting kind of cold in here. Just ate some cheesy crumpets, but I couldn't record because my camera was charging. Because that shot of me reading the books was so long. Oh my god, it's 7 PM already. Wow, so I'm gonna have to end today's video here. I'm gonna put this together and start making tomorrow's. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.